and socialize the losses. But you need a political cycle that allows this. And election time tends to be a time when major parties would rather wait and let someone else take the difficult step. I suspect you will see the government stepping in, but rather than step in with a very targeted intervention, it will do something more general, which is another fiscal stimulus package.
What do you think of the US dollar versus other currencies?
We're in the midst of a cyclical strengthening of the dollar, but I would stress cyclical. Long term, I think it's almost unambiguous that the dollar will go weaker, and the only question is weaker against what? So far, the burden of the appreciation has been carried by currencies that are allowed to appreciate. And we're living in a world where there's a block of countries, mainly in Asia and the Middle East, that are pegged to the dollar. So in order for the dollar to weaken, it has to weaken by a lot more against currencies that are allowed to appreciate, which is the euro. The next phase is going to be the dollar weakening against currencies that so far haven't been allowed to weaken but will be allowed to weaken. Why that changed? Because of what we talked about earlier, inflation. If you are China, if you are the Middle East, it is now in your interest to allow your currency to appreciate because that helps you on the inflation front. It helps you combat inflation. So if you were to take a 3 to 5 year view, it would be for renewed dollar weakness, but with an important qualifier, that it will be now more likely to be against currencies that are currently pegged to the dollar than currencies that are free-floating against the dollar.
In my lifetime, I've never seen as much bearishness as I've seen here. There's the largest amount of shorts that have ever been in the marketplace at this time. There's enormous amounts of cash that just sit within money markets, and institutions are carrying large amounts of cash. And there's the sovereign wealth cash. I mean, the more we pay for oil, the more money is going overseas to different places. Now, some of it's being diminished by Russia's 25% inflation rate, but clearly in the Middle East there's a lot of cash going over there. And the one particular place that people feel a certain amount of safety is investing in the U.S. But there can be made a case here that the end of the world is not necessarily at hand.
There are opportunities. In fact, PIMCO is investing significantly into instruments high up in the capital structure that we believe are absolute bargains today. However, if you want to take advantage of this, you have to have certain characteristics of your capital that allows you to stay in the game, because this is a very bumpy journey. So first, you have to be certain that you're not going to need to liquidate in order to finance something. You have to have a certain permanency to your capital.
For individuals, we have stressed that they maintain 2 to 3 years of cash to be able to get through, so you don't have to make a bad decision. Having that cash really does allow you to sit through whether or not everybody's right and Citibank's going back to 50, which seems highly unlikely. This might be a good time to be able to get there.
So you need the cash and you need the mindset. Sometimes people have the cash but not the mindset.
Right.
And you need critically to be high up the capital structure. I think the mistake people made with Citi and with other financial systems is they didn't recognize that it matters a great deal whether you're a bond holder or whether you're an equity holder. When you are de-risking a financial system, it's great if you're a bond holder because you're holding a claim on something that is now less risky. If you're an equity holder and you own shares, you're going to be diluted. Let me give you the example of munis. Municipal bonds should not trade more expensive than nominal bonds. After all, we get a tax relief on them. Mm-hmm. Today, you can buy high-quality municipal bonds that are trading at higher yields than the equivalent nominal bond. If you brought an economist here, they'll tell you that shouldn't happen. That is an outright arbitrage opportunity. and yet it occurs. Why? Because there isn't much capital available, and people are being forced to deleverage. So there's a lot of distressed selling going on. So whether it's municipals, whether it's mortgages, whether it's bank capital, whether it's swaps, there's a whole host of opportunities out there, as long as you're able to underwrite the inevitable volatility.
Your asset allocation is totally different than an asset allocation for most of us that would have existed 2 or 3 years ago. So maybe you could tell us how you think an individual should be setting his or her asset allocation.
If I look at what the typical person does, the average person, recognizing that the distribution around the average is quite large, 3 things hit you immediately. First, the average person is too US-centric. We like the familiar. So we tend to overinvest. We tend to have what's called a home bias. If you believe that the world is changing, that home bias is going to cost you money, because the dynamic part of the global economy is shifting away from the US to the rest of the world. The second question is, how much inflation protection do I have in my portfolio? We're coming from a period where there was what's called the Great Moderation, huge disinflationary forces. And that has changed. We're now looking at a world that has inflationary pressure. And the average investor is under-allocated to real assets, under-allocated to assets that protect you against inflation. The third element is perhaps the toughest, which is that the average investor puts his or herself into buckets that are too narrow. We tend to think of bonds, equities, or cash. What endowments realize very early on is you need an other category, because opportunities come up that are not easily defined as equities or bonds. They are on the borderline, whereas there are a lot of potential returns there. So the 3 things I would say to your members is, first, check on your home bias. Does it make sense in terms of how the world is changing? Second, do you have enough inflation protection? And third, be open to this category called special opportunities that doesn't fit easily in.
So when you say special opportunities, you mean things like
infrastructure.
Infrastructure.
Infrastructure is something where there's tremendous demand. You can do it through private equity. You can do it through certain bonds that offer you access. You can do it directly. There's lots of ways to do it, right? But you have to be open to the notion of, is this a good idea or not? My experience is that, including myself, and I speak to that, is when your financial advisor calls with something that doesn't fit in easily, we tend to impose a much higher hurdle than we really should. Right? And the reason why we do is because we've become hostage of our existing allocation.
From what I remember about the book,